Welcome, friend. Tonight, we drift softly into the ancient world, following the quiet footsteps of a queen remembered for beauty, brilliance, and a destiny written beneath desert stars. Our story begins long before Cleopatra's birth, in the golden halls of Alexandria, a city of scholars, shimmering harbors, and a lighthouse whose fire guided travelers across distant seas. In this city of knowledge and power, Cleopatra would one day walk as its final pharaoh. Its last voice before Egypt fell into Rome's shadow. She was born in 69 BC in the royal palace near the Mediterranean shore, where waves whispered against marble walls and the scent of papyrus drifted through open courtyards. The newborn Princess Belengetto, the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, speaking Greek in the palace while Egypt itself spoke another tongue. But Cleopatra was different. She would grow to learn the Egyptian language, honoring the people she ruled, and becoming the first of her dynasty to speak to Egypt in its own voice. As a child, she wandered the palace gardens, listening to tutors speak of astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and politics. Her mind was sharp, absorbing knowledge like the Nile absorbs starlight. Every night, she gazed at the constellations, tracing the stories of the gods across the velvet darkness, wondering if destiny had also written her name among them. In the great library of Alexandria, scholars debated the shape of the world. Cleopatra, still only a girl, sat quietly among them, soaking in their wisdom with a calm, steady curiosity. The palace corridors echoed with the steps of her siblings, each one raised to believeth he alone deserved the throne. The quiet rivalry would one day shape her fate. Cleopatra learned early that a royal life was never quiet for long. Whispers filled the palace, advisors plotting, siblings competing, and Egypt itself caught between powerful empires. As she grew older, her voice became steady, calm, and strangely commanding. Servants paused to listen. Tutors admired her sharp memory and gentle confidence. She watched merchants serve from distant lands, Nubia, Arabia, Crete, bringing perfumes, spices, and stories of changing powers beyond Egypt's borders. Rome was rising, its influence stretching like a long shadow over the Mediterranean. Cleopatra sensed that her future would be tied to theirs. But before Rome, she faced her own family. Her father, Ptolemy I, a man heavy with worry, struggled to keep his throne against internal rivals. He trusted Cleopatra more than any other child. When she was just 14, he made her co-ruler in training, letting her read official letters and observe meetings in silent attentiveness. She listened, learned, and memorized every detail: how negotiations worked, how enemies smiled politely, and how power often traveled through words. At night, while the palace slept, Cleopatra walked balconies overlooking Alexandria's harbor. The steady rhythm of waves felt like the heartbeat of her growing destiny. She understood something early: that ruling Egypt will demand far more than royal blood. It required intelligence, courage, and a calm mind in the face of storms. By 18, Cleopatra stood on the edge of her greatest challenge, the throne itself. But the path was tangled with danger, and her first battle would be fought against her own brother. When their father died, Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy I, were declared co-rulers. Two crowns balanced Egypt on one fragile kingdom. But behind the ceremony, the truth simmered. Powerful advisors run the young boy, whispering that Egypt should belong to him alone. Cleopatra, older, wiser, and far more prepared, felt the tide shifting against her. Still, she remained calm, trusting her mind over their noise. In her early months as queen, she traveled the Nile, listening to farmers, priests, and merchants. She wanted to understand her people, their needs, their rhythms, their hopes. Along the river, villagers bowed respectfully, grateful to see a ruler who spoke their language, an Egyptian queen both spirit and voice. But the advisors in Alexandria are tightening their circle. They accused Cleopatra of ambition, of plotting alone, of being too independent for their comfort. Slander spread quickly through the palace halls. Soon, her brother's ministers moved against her, stripping her name from official documents. Cleopatra found herself pushed from her own throne not by warriors, but by signatures, whispers, and shifting loyalties. For her safety, she left Alexandria, traveling east toward the desert land near Syria, far from the marble halls that once echoed with her plans. Yet even in exile, Cleopatra did not despair. She gathered loyal supporters, observed the political winds, and waited for the moment to return, patient as the Nile awaiting its flood. In the months of her exile, Cleopatra watched the horizon, knowing Egypt's fate was shifting toward something larger, toward Rome, toward conflict, toward an alliance that would change her life forever. Because far across the sea, two Roman generals were locked in a quiet struggle for control of the empire, Pompey, the great, and Julius Caesar. When their rivalry exploded into civil war, Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping the young boy king would offer him refuge. But Ptolemy's advisor made a cruel decision. Believing Caesar would soon arrive, they greeted Pompey not with safety, but with a blade. They presented his severed head to Caesar on the shores of Alexandria, expecting gratitude for their loyalty. Instead, Caesar recoiled in disgust. He despised treachery, and the act only deepened his distrust of the young Ptolemy's court. Cleopatra sensed opportunity. Caesar was now in Alexandria, a man of immense power, a man whose favor could restore her throne. But entering the palace was impossible. Her brother's guards watched every gate, seeking to keep her far from Rome's greatest general. So Cleopatra crafted a daring plan. Under the cover of night, she sailed back into the city, hidden beneath the gentle sway of shadows and silence. With the help of a loyal servant, she wrapped herself in a simple carpet, not for drama, but for survival, and was smuggled directly into Caesar's private chambers. When the carpet was unrolled, Cleopatra stepped forward, calm, graceful, and completely composed. The flickering lamplight sifted her presence, and Caesar, surprised, could not look away. She spoke gently, not begging, not demanding, simply explaining her plight, her exile, and her desire to rule not for herself, but for Egypt's stability. Caesar, a man weary of shouts and political games, saw in her a rare mixture of intelligence, courage, and steady restraint. He admired her fluency in many languages, her calm reasoning, and the quiet strength beneath her words. In that peaceful conversation, an alliance began to form. The next morning, Caesar summoned both siblings to the palace. He declared that Cleopatra and Ptolemy would rule together once more. But the young king's advisors supplemented with fury. They feared Cleopatra's return, and even more, they feared Rome's influence over their kingdom. Tension simmered through Alexandria's streets. Crowds gathered, rumors spread, and whispers of rebellion floated like dust through the hot air. Cleopatra remained near Caesar, composed and observant. She knew Egypt was moving toward conflict, and that her survival depended on calmness, the rising storm. Soon, Ptolemy's forces surrounded the palace, blocking exits, cutting supplies, and preparing to forcefully remove Cleopatra once more. In response, Caesar's soldiers took positions within the palace walls. The quiet halls that once echoed with scholars and musicians braced for the first sparks of war. The siege of the palace unfolded slowly at first. Smoke drifted from nearby fires, torches flickered along the walls, and distant shouts echoed through Alexandria's night. Inside, Cleopatra stayed near Caesar, listening as he planned defense with calm determination. Though outnumbered, his loyalty to her did not waver. Cleopatra moved quickly through shaded corridors, comforting servants, offering calm words and keeping the palace steady even as tension tightened around its stone walls. Outside, the boy kings force tightened their grip. Arrows struck balconies, and the distant clatter of shields vibrated like a restless heartbeat through the marble floors. Then came the fire. As fighting spread to the harbor, flames leapt toward the great library of Alexandria. Scrolls, stories, and centuries of knowledge were swallowed by smoke. Historians still debate how much was truly lost, but Cleopatra, watching from the palace, felt a deep ache as if part of her city's soul were drifting away in the wind. The fighting continued for weeks, a slow and exhausting struggle. Caesar's forces held their ground, not with numbers, but with discipline, and the quiet resolvedo outlast the chaos. Cleopatra remained composed, her presence a steady beacon amid fear and uncertainty. Soldiers respected her calm, servants trusted her voice, and even Caesar found comfort in her steadiness. When reinforcements from Rome finally arrived by sea, the balance shifted. Ptolemy's army faltered, and the young king attempted to flee across the Nile. But his escape ended in tragedy. The overloaded boat capsized, and Ptolemy Z was claimed by the river that had shaped Egypt for thousands of years. With the conflict over, Cleopatra returned to the Palatinate as an exile, but as Egypt's rightful queen. The city exhaled, and the Nile moved calmly under a soft morning sun. Caesar declared that Cleopatra would rule beside a younger brother, Ptolemy Ziv, a boy too young to challenge her authority. For the first time, her throne felt secure. Life in Alexandria shifted into gentle order. Markets reopened, scholars returned to their studies, and musicians once again filled the royal halls with soft melodies. Cleopatra, now in her early 20s, walked the palace gardens with a renewed sense of purpose. She felt Egypt's future resting calmly in her hands. Her alliance with Caesar grew stronger. They shared conversations about philosophy, governance, and the fragile balance between power and peace. In time, their political partnership became something deeper, a bond formed not by strategy alone, but by mutual respect and the quiet connection built into brilliant minds. When Caesar Preparetto returned to Rome, Cleopatra chose to accompany him. She traveled up the Tiber on a luxurious barge, its silken sails catching the warm Italian breeze. In Rome, her presence caused a stir. Citizens gathered just to glimpse her. The foreign queen's calm elegance made even marble statues seem less graceful. She stayed in Caesar's villa across the river, surrounded by gardens and evening lanterns. There, she observed the pulse of Roman politics and the ambition that drove the Republic. But her visit was not without tension. Roman senators whispered behind closed doors, uneasy about Caesar's affection for the Egyptian queen who carried his son. Despite the whispers, Cleopatra moved through Rome with quiet dignity. She was not there to provoke, only to observe, and to ensure Egypt's future remained stable under Caesar's protection. She witnessed the Roman forum buzzing with debates, the marble temples glowing under the afternoon sun, and the restless energy of a republic stretched between ambition and fear. But beneath the calm surface, tensions were rising. Some senators feared Caesar's growing power, and Cleopatra sensed that the harmony of Rome was beginning to fracture. One afternoon, as spring breezes rustled the trees, Cleopatra walked the gardens off Caesar's villa, her young son at her side, a quiet moment before history shifted. Then came the Ides of March. Cleopatra heard the noose in a wave of hushed voices. Caesar had been struck down inside the Senate, betrayed by Thossi, who once called allies. The peaceful villa fell into silence. Cleopatra held her son close, understanding instantly that without Caesar, Rome was no longer safe for either of them. She prepared quietly, gathering only loyal servants, and slipped away from Rome before the chaos fully consumed the city. Back in Egypt, The familiar warmth off the Alexandria sun felt like a slow exhale. But the world had changed, and new Roman powers were rising beyond the sea. Two figures now stood at the center of Rome, Mark Antony and Octavian, each pulling the Republic in different directions. Cleopatra watched carefully. She knew Egypt's fate would once again tied to whichever Roman proved strong in auto shaped the future. Years passed quickly until a new Roman envoy arrived in Alexandria, Mark Antony, a man of sharp instinct, restless ambition, and a charisma that filled any room he entered. Cleopatra sensed at once that Antony was different from the senators of Rome. He valued strength, admired intelligence, and carried a warmth beneath his bold exterior. She invited him to a grand reception along the Nile. Her barge drifted toward him with purple sails, golden lanterns glowing softly against the calm water. Antony watched in awe as Cleopatra appeared calm, serene, and surrounded by servants holding gentle incense that perfumed the night air. It felt almost like meeting a legend. The two spoke for hours, sharing stories of Caesar, of Rome, and of Egypt's fragile peace. A bond soon formed, part political, part personal, entirely genuine. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to secure his position. Cleopatra needed Rome's strength to protect her son. Their alliance grew naturally, like two currents merging in a quiet tide. As months drifted by, Antony remained in Alexandria. He enjoyed the city's music, its shimmering nights, and the calm, intelligent Cleopatra carried every conversation. He soon realized that alongside her grace was a mind trained for diplomacy, strategy, and the delicate art of preserving a kingdom between empires. Together, they traveled the Nile, visiting temples and small villages, where Cleopatra greeted people in their own language, a gesture that filled them with quiet pride. For a time, their world felt peaceful. Cleopatra found companionship. Antony found purpose. And Egypt, bathed in warm sunlight, rested gently between their intertwined destinies. But peace rarely lasted in the ancient world. News arrived from Rome. Octavian, Caesar's heir, was rising in power, slowly drawing the world into his tight, calculated orbit. Antony was summoned. Cleopatra watched him depart, the harbor quaked beneath the morning sun. She knew Rome's storms never traveled alone. In Rome, Antony found Octavian growing stronger, his influence spreading like a shadow at dusk. Whispers of rivalry echoed through the Senate. To maintain unity, Antony agreed to a political marriage, Octavian's sister, Octavia. A union of necessity, not affection, but one that stung Cleopatra deeply. Months passed, then years. Cleopatra ruled Egypt with steady grace, keeping the kingdom stable, waiting, hoping the man she trusted would one day return. When he finally did, Antony arrived in Alexandria from politics and exhausted by Rome's intrigues. Cleopatra welcomed him with neither anger nor accusation, only quiet understanding. Now older, but more certain than ever, their partnership rekindled with deeper purpose. They would stand together against Octavian's rising power. They hosted festivals, strengthened alliances, and presented themselves as rulers of the East, a symbol Octavian could not ignore. In Rome, Octavian seized upon this. He painted Cleopatra, a dangerous foreign queen, and Antonius, a man butchered into betraying Rome. The Senate listened. The people listened. And slowly, Octavian transformed a political rivalry into a moral crusade, one that would soon ignite a war. Antony returned to Egypt, but Octavian's accusations followed him like a persistent echo. The Roman world began choosing sides, and the air grew heavy with the scent of conflict. Cleopatra understood how dangerous narratives could be. A story once unleashed could topple kings as easily as armies. And Octavian's story was spreading fast. To counter him, Antony and Cleopatra forged their own vision of a restored Eastern Empire, strong, prosperous, and independent of Rome's grasp. Together, they assembled fleets, fortified ports, and prepared allies. Not out of thirst for conquest, but out of necessity. Survival demanded strength. In the quiet halls of Alexandria's palace, they discussed strategilate into the night. Maps spread before them, candles flickering softly as they imagined what the future might hold. But beneath the planningly and unspoken truth, they were fighting a man who mastered politics the way generals mastered war. Octavian launched a campaign of letters, declarations, and carefully crafted speeches, turning Rome's fears into fuel for his rise. He attacked Cleopatra directly, claiming she sought to rule the Roman world through seduction and gold. A foreign queen, he insisted, must never command Rome's destiny. Antony was painted as her helpless puppet, a once great Romano lost to passion. It was propaganda, but powerful, precisely what Octavian needed. So when war was declared, it was not against Antony, a Roman citizen, but against Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, a political maneuver as sharp as any blade. Cleopatra met the news with calm resolve. She had weathered betrayals, famines, and the shifting tides of empire. If Rome wanted a fight, Egypt would not meet it trembling. Antony, too, prepared. Though wounded by Rome's judgment, his loyalty to Cleopatra and to their shared vision remained unshaken. Their forces gathered near the western coast of Greece, ships gleaming beneath the sun, oars ready, sails tightened. It was a moment heavy with possibility. But Octavian's fleet was disciplined, well-supplied, and commanded by a master tactician. The stage was set for a decisive clash. This confrontation, the Battle of Actium, was more than a naval fight. It was a struggle for the future of Rome, and the fate of Egypt rested quietly in the balance. As dawn broke, the sea shimmered like polished bronze. Cleopatra's flagship stood at the center, its purple sails catching the morning light. Antony commanded nearby, moving between ships, steadying nerves, reminding his men that they were fighting not just for power, but for a world free from Octavian's control. When the battle began, the sea roared with motion, oars cutting water, arrows hissing, shouts rising in a storm of chaos. Cleopatra held position, watching the formations shift, waiting for the crucial moment that might turn disaster into victory. But Antony's fleet struggled to maneuver. Octavian's lighter ships pressed in, tightening their grip with patient precision. Smoke drifted across the water, turning the horizon into a blurred painting. Antony's ships burned, their oars snapping beneath the clash of iron and rising flames. Cleopatra saw the tide shifting. Her fleet, positioned at the rear, remained untouched, a final shadow preserved what remained of Egypt's strength. She made a choice swift, painful, and necessary. Her ships turned south, breaking from the battle, sails catching the wind as they fled the tightening circle. Antony looked back, saw her colors drifting away, and believed the fight was lost. Without hesitation, he followed, leaving the field to Octavian. History would later claim this flight was betrayal. But in truth, it was survival, a retreat Mianto saved the remnants of a kingdom already surrounded. They sailed for days, winds shifting, thoughts heavy. When they reached Egypt, Alexandria greeted them with uneasy silence. News of the defeat raced ahead of them. Whispers filled markets, temples, and narrow alleys. Some spoke with fear, others with sorrow. Yet Cleopatra did not collapse beneath the weight of loss. She returned to her throne, gathered advisors, and prepared for the final chapter of Egypt's independence. Antony, however, was shaken, his confidence cracked, haunted by the image of burning ships. and fading hope. Still, Cleopatra stayed, by his side, steady, calm, and determined to hold Egypt together against the storm that marched toward them. Octavian advanced, slowly, methodically absorbing territories. One by one, each step tightened the invisible noose around Alexandria. In the palace halls, Cleopatra walked with quiet purpose. She consulted engineers, fortified defenses, and prepared stores. For a siege, she knew, might come. But Egypt was weary. Years of tension, fleets lost, and Rome's looming threat had drained its spirit. Even loyal soldiers felt the weight of the coming end. Antony tried to rally his forces, but the army that once stood proudly beside him had shrunk, its morale flickering like a candle in the wind. Yet Cleopatra remained composed. She refused to let fear shape her final days. If the gods had written a bitter fate, she would meet it with dignity. When Octavian arrived, outside Alexandria, the city braced itself. Walls trembled with footsteps, streets emptied, and every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. Antony led a small force in one last attempt to break the encirclement. For a brief moment, he tasted victory. Octavian's troops pushed back in surprise, but momentum faded. Reinforcements arrived for Octavian, and Antony's men fell into retreat, exhausted and outnumbered. When false news reached him that Cleopatra had taken her own life, Antony's strength finally shattered. The world he fought for seemed to crumble in a single breath. Heartbroken, he collapsed upon his sword, a Roman death, carried out with trembling hands. Yet he lived long enough to be brought to Cleopatra, as he had silently wished. They carried Antony to her hidden chamber, his breath shallow, his armor stained with dust and sorrow. Cleopatra rushed to him, her voice breaking as she whispered his name. He asked to be lifted, to see her face clearly. With her arms around him, he murmured that he had loved her, not as a king, not as a soldier, but as a man. In that final moment, Cleopatra felt the world go eerily still. Rome, war, danger, everything faded, leaving only the quiet truth of two lives intertwined. When Antony's breath finally slipped away, Cleopatra held him for a long time, letting the grief move through her like a slow tide. But she knew there was no time to collapse. Octavian was here, and he wanted her alive, as a trophy, a prisoner, a symbol of Rome's victory. Cleopatra refused to be paraded through Roman streets, mocked by crowds, reduced to a spectacle rather than a queen. She met with Octavian once, calm and regal, even in mourning. He admired her intellect, but saw only political value, not the woman, not the leader. Afterwards, Cleopatra knew what she must do. If Egypt was to fall, it would fall on her own terms, not as Rome's captive. She retreated to her mausoleum, the grand chamber she had built. For the day, she would no longer walk among the living, surrounded by treasures, gold, and symbols of her reign. She prepared herself for the final act, an ending shaped by her own resolve. She dressed carefully, choosing robes of deep royal color, the kind she wore in the early days of her reign. Even in farewell, she honored the throne she had carried. In the quiet, she thought of her children, their voices, their futures, their fragile place in a world now ruled by Rome's rising empire. She left instructions for their protection, hoping Octavian might show mercy to innocents untouched by war or politics. Then, in the soft glow of lamplight, Cleopatra sat among the symbols of Egypt's ancient power, breathing slowly, deeply. Some say she used a poison kept hidden in a ring or comb. Others tell the famous story of the asp, silent, swift, and sacred. Whichever tale is true, her passing was deliberate, graceful, the final choice of a queen determined to guard her dignity. When Octavian received word, he hurried to the chamber, hoping to prevent her death, but he arrived too late. Cleopatra was still, her features calm, as though asleep. He stood quietly, realizing that the victory parade he envisioned would never happen. Cleopatra had denied him his final triumph. Her body was laid beside Antony's, just as she wished. Two lives joined, in defiance, in tragedy, and in one final act of unity. And with her passing, Egypt as the world had known it slipped into memory. The last pharaoh was gone, and Rome claimed its final jewel. Alexandria mourned quietly, the city that once sparkled with scholars, sailors, and dreamers, felt suddenly hollow, its heartbeat dimmed by the loss of its final sovereign. Temples offered prayers, scribes recorded her reign, and citizens whispered her name with a mix of sorrow and admiration. Even her rivals could not deny the force of her legacy. For Cleopatra was more than myth, more than beauty, more than the stories Rome crafted. She was a ruler who fought fiercely for her people. She navigated a world of empires, generals, and political storms, holding Egypt steady longer than any outsider believed possible. Octavian returned to Rome with Egypt in his grasp. The victory cemented his power, paving the way for him to become Augustus, the first emperor of a new Roman age. But even as he celebrated, Cleopatra's shadow followed him. She had been his greatest rival, a woman who challenged his rise with intellect and will. Across the centuries, her story traveled from scrolls to marble inscriptions, from poets to historians, each adding their own layer. Some painted her as a temptress, others as a strategist, a mother, a scholar, a sovereign shaped by impossible choices. But beneath every version lies the same truth. Cleopatra lived boldly and refused to surrender her dignity, even in the face of empire. And though time has softened her story into legend, the heartbeat of the real woman still echoes through history's halls. In the centuries that followed, artists sculpted her image, writers reimagined her words, and empires invoked her name, each seeking fragments of the queen who defied Rome. Some saw her as a tragic lover, others a brilliant politician, a guardian of Egypt, or a symbol of feminine power in a world ruled by men. But the truth, quiet and steady, remained simple. Cleopatra was a leader who carried a kingdom on her shoulders until her final breath. She spoke many languages, commanded fleets, negotiated with generals, and built alliances with a clarity few rulers ever matched. She preserved Egypt's culture, its wealth, its independence, not through force alone, but through diplomacy, intelligence, and unbroken resolve. Her reign marked the last chapter of the ancient pharaohs. After her, the temples dimmed, the royal bloodlines ended, and Egypt became a province of Rome, yet her memory never faded. It traveled with historians, flowed through poetry, echoed in Shakespeare's lines, and crossed oceans to live again in modern stories. And through it all, one image endures: Cleopatra standing tall in a world determined to break her, a queen who met fate with unshakable grace. So tonight, as you drift toward rest, let her story settle. Like gentle ash, a reminder that courage often blooms quietly in the moments no one sees. And in the hush between waking and sleep, remember this: Cleopatra's strength was never in her crown, but in her will to shape her own destiny. History often remembers the battles, the alliances, the rise and fall of empires. But in the quiet spaces, it also remembers the people, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. And Cleopatra, far beyond the myths, was a woman who fought fiercely to protect her homeland, who loved deeply, and who refused to bow to those who sought to diminish her. So as the night settles, let her journey be a gentle companion, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, there is strength in choosing one's own path. Thank you for joining this story, for walking through the sands of Egypt, for witnessing a life that still glows softly across 2,000 years. Now rest, let your thoughts quiet, and drift into sleep with the calm certainty that history holds countless stories waiting to be heard. Good night.